Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Again, I'm Rick Samans with the Geneva Graduate Institute for International Development Studies, but particularly here wearing a hat as a special advisor to the United Nations Economist Network. And like to welcome all of you to what is actually the very first activity of a new Network of Networks initiative, which is an attempt in association with the United Nations Economist Network, which is a community of about 500 plus economists across the UN system, different agencies and countries. It's an attempt to form a stronger constellation and level of connectivity amongst thinkers and scholars in different disciplines who are working on fundamental change in the very conception and practice of growth and development. There's a very strong focus on having a more fundamental inquiry and hopefully development of some practical solutions to real world problems, which standard or orthodox economics doesn't do a full job by any stretch in addressing in many respects. It's extremely, I think, appropriate, really auspicious for our first activity be kicking off with this book webinar, which will be first in a series of these, but with this book by Professor James Galbraith, Entropy Economics, the living basis of value production. This is an ambitious, courageous, even Herculean effort, I would say, not just to take on the general equilibrium mental model, neoclassical economics, the canon of thought and tools around that, but to seek to actually dislodge it in two key respects, I would say. One is conceptually, logically, and the book does a remarkable job, particularly in the early sections of doing that. And then secondly, by going toe-to-toe with the profession in mathematical terms, if you will, kind of beating them at their own game, their own very revered game of technical abstraction and internal consistency and elegance, which is really part of what has grown up around the field of economics. I think both of those elements are remarkable in their audaciousness and their need for them. So I'm absolutely excited and even thrilled, which is not a term I typically use for my own rather reserved countenance, and having our first activity of this group be on this discussion and with Professor Galbraith. So I want to thank all of the academic members of networks who have joined us here, as well as our colleagues in the UN Economist Network across the system. This book goes deep into what I have called elsewhere the source code of economics, and is proposing not just a patch, but a wholesale renovation and even replacement of at least big parts of it, particularly in respect of the core focus of what has been the core focus of economics for so long, which is production. And it's done so in a fascinating way by invoking physical sciences, some of the most elemental concepts of physical sciences, physics, biology, entropy, and thermodynamics in particular, and apply them in wholesale formulation of the way economies, or at least that production dimension, should be understood and managed. So it's really a remarkable intellectual accomplishment in my view. And I simply want to put that out there to begin with. Now, that's enough said for me by way of context. Hopefully I've gotten your attention even beyond that required to get you to join this, this webinar. And let me just say, in terms of how we will organize today's session, after Professor Galbraith gives his opening discussion of the book, the key parts of it, then we'll have two distinguished discussants, which we're so lucky to have with us. I want to thank both of them for joining us. Dr. Anastasia Nesvetailova, who's the head of the Macroeconomics and Development Policy Branch of UNCTAD. Thanks so much for for your presence, your physical, live in-person presence, Anastasia. And then Professor Steve Keen, thank you as well for joining us, a distinguished research fellow of the UCL Institute for Strategy, Resilience, and Security, among other affiliations and accomplishments over the years, including his own important treatises on the need for a fundamental reform of the way economics is conceived and practiced around the world. So we will have the opening set of thoughts from Professor Galbraith, and we'll go for 5 to 7 minutes of reactions and comments from Anastasia and Steve. Then we'll go back to James for some of his reflections on their reflections, and then open it up. The bulk of the session, or at least half the session, I would imagine, would be an opportunity for interaction with Professor Galbraith, questions, comments, discussions, which we'll moderate. And for that purpose, I would encourage you online to use the Zoom chat function. That might be the most efficient way to do things. You can raise your hand too electronically. That's fine. So kind of either one, but we'll try to manage this as best we can across those two features of the Zoom webinar tool. So with all of that, over to you, Professor Galbraith.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's an honor to launch this series of webinars, which were initiated and organized by Rick Samans. And I've been privileged to work with you on some of the design of this, and I'll just say that we hope that this series will call global attention to some of the most important new work and new voices on policy-relevant economics, with an emphasis on scholarship that meets the tests of accessibility and depth normally associated with significant books. And in this way, also reward the originality and nonconformism that the culture of journals tends to suppress in our field. Now, in saying this, by no means do I wish to imply that my new book, Entropy Economics, The Living Basis of Value in Production, co-authored with my friend and my very talented friend Jing Chen, meets all of the tests that I just set forth. My voice is hardly new, and while there are fresh formulations in our book, it draws on recent work in biophysical economics, on the evolutionary and institutionalist traditions, on John Maynard Keynes and Joseph Schumpeter, on classical political economy, and on related disciplines in natural science, biology, and physics. Our claim is that a compact and clear statement of principles in these traditions generates a better foundation for economic analysis and, above all, for economic policy than the doctrines that continue to underpin the mainstream, despite their manifest colossal failures that cannot, at this stage, be denied or wished away. Development policy, energy policy, environmental policy, financial and trade policy, all of these areas would benefit from a shift of perspective toward the common sense principles that we try to articulate in this book. There it is. And to which we give mathematical expression, as well as trying to state in clear and accessible English what it's all about. The conventional mainstream is centered on a supposed ideal, and that ideal is of a self-organizing system of markets: labor markets, capital markets, markets for goods and services, markets for money, in which rational profit-seeking agents interact and which tend toward balance, that is to say, toward an equilibrium through discovery and adjustment of prices. I think that's a fair statement. The concepts of utility of preferences form a psychological theory of value that underpins this standard view. The mainstream admits that defects and failures are possible. In fact, the textbooks are, of course, full of these ideas: monopoly, externalities, information asymmetries, public goods, and on and on. But these are departures from the ideal case. Improvement generally consists in minimizing them so far as possible so that you approach toward the ideal. In this scheme of things, government is a burden. Regulation is a cost. Taxes are a distortion. All of these things are embedded in the language that economists habitually use. And the policy ideal is efficiency in the functioning of markets. There is a universal policy template. It was called, well, I think it's somewhat in disrepute now, but the Washington Consensus for Development Strategy, which predominated for 30 or 40 years, an ideal program with the peculiar feature that no successful development strategy ever adopted or conformed to it. Resources play no special role in this framework. They are inputs and outputs like any other. And the fixed commitments required of capital investment are largely ignored. So what we call entropy economics merely starts from the physical fact that all activity requires access to high quality, low entropy resources. This is the fundamental basis of any living process, any mechanical process, and any social process. To obtain these resources, you can get them from the soil, you can get them from the sun, you can get them from the atom, requires prior fixed investment, a technological commitment. Such investments are made under uncertainty in the hope of profit. Any business knows this. Generally, integrated investments of larger scale are more efficient, at least they can be more efficient. And all such investments occur according to plans laid down by companies or by governments. And all of them are subject to regulations. Markets flourish when the conditions that make positive returns possible, not maximum returns, but positive returns. You don't have to have a maximum return, and a maximum return might be a negative return, but the return does have to be positive if a market is going to grow. If it's negative, the market will deteriorate and ultimately disappear. In other words, it will fail. But there are no markets without governing structures, that is to say, without governments. And successful regulation, we would argue, is maybe the main distinguishing feature of an advanced country as opposed to, let's call it a less advanced or developing country. Not all regulations work well, but without regulations, the cost of doing business multiplies, and the complications multiply, difficulties multiply. It's regulations that make our lives run smoothly in the so-called advanced countries. A key function of regulation in all of its many forms is to control and reduce inequalities. Does this explicitly when we're talking about progressive taxation, and it does it in many other ways, and reflect to the health outcomes and the quality of nutrition and everything about living standards. Essentially, regulation is about reducing the amount of inequality that would otherwise occur. Successful regulation and successful development balance the need for inequality. Inequality is what makes us do things. It's what motivates us to try to achieve, and it's what underpins, in thermodynamic terms, the ability to do any kind of work. That's Carnot's principle, basic foundation of thermodynamics. And successful regulation, successful development, balance the need for inequality as a motivating force against the need to keep the system stable so far as possible. If you allow inequalities to get out of hand, income inequalities, wealth inequalities, environmental inequalities, you tend to run toward crisis. This is no different from any living or mechanical system. As I remind colleagues of my age, you control your blood pressure in order to keep that level of inequality under control. Entropy economics stresses that complex systems with high fixed cost, though generally efficient, are fragile. They are prone to crises when conditions change and the cost of resources presses on the margin of profit. Rich societies with abundant resources develop sinks of waste. The military, the bureaucracy, the lobbies, the financial sector, among the prominent examples. And the key to successful resolution of crises when they occur is the just and effective reduction of these structures of fixed cost against the most powerful and entrenched sources of waste. Unfortunately, this rarely happens, which is why societies tend to decline and fail over time. The more general case is that cuts fall on those who are least able to resist them. And you see this process underway in response to crises practically everywhere that they occur. That is why famine is political, as Amartya Sen taught many years ago. But there is a larger and more subtle and enduring and insidious consequence. I'll just call attention to it briefly. The same principle that applies to countries, to industries, to firms, also applies to households. They have fixed costs, particularly in advanced societies, but they also have variable costs and variable incomes. And the more pressure is put on their incomes, and the more their costs rise in relation to their variable costs in relation to the fixed costs, the more they suffer from austerity and precarity. And they make decisions in response to that. And the decision, perhaps the most important decision that they make reflects the size of the household. When variable costs rise and incomes are insecure, fixed costs must be cut. And frequently the path of least resistance is to have fewer children. In all wealthy countries, and in many that are not wealthy, we observe declining fertility rates with economic crises and rising resource costs. A very prominent fact in the wake of the financial crisis 15 years ago. This process will eventually lead to declines, and perhaps quite rapid declines, in human populations. Entropy economics is human-centered. It's a human-centered economics because it applies the logic of living systems and ordinary business organizations to economic systems at all scales, great and small. The analysis is not an especially happy one. We live in a difficult world, but it is realistic. It calls for policies adapted to circumstances and to the difficulties of the present circumstances in which our access to high quality, low entropy resources is not as great as it once was. And this means that we have to address our problems with local rather than universal expertise. I regret to say to my professional colleagues, that's not especially good news for academic economists, but it should be welcomed by specialists in the field who have earned their expertise the hard way by understanding the circumstances and the problems of the communities and countries in which they have developed their experience. And it should be welcomed by autonomous and sovereign decision makers in independent countries, many of whom understand the common sense of the propositions I've just been offering by virtue of their practical experience and their training in other fields, engineering, public administration, and natural science. These fields all lead toward, I think, a common sense appreciation of the basic principles that I've just been trying to express. A webinar is not an ideal format to present the mathematical basis of our argument, but I'll just summarize the two core propositions as briefly as I can, and then turn it over to the commentators. First of all, value, we argue, is best theorized in a way that's quite close to the classical tradition as a function of scarcity, but also as a function of market power. This is what businesses do when they wish to embark on a new endeavor. They try to find something where a niche where they have a strong market position, or they're introducing a product which has not saturated the market already. Economic value thus decreases as products diffuse and as competition increases. And this can be captured. One of the insights to which I give great credit to my co-author, Jing Chen. It can be captured in a very simple way with a logarithmic function in which the argument of the logarithm is the scarcity or the probability of a process or a good, and the degree of market control, the number of suppliers, is expressed as the base of the logarithm, which works very well. The decision to produce is effectively expressed as a thermodynamic process relating fixed and variable cost, project duration, discount rate, and uncertainty, the expectation of profit. And that too can be expressed in a way which is a little bit more complicated to explain, but allows you to develop in a very simple way some of the most important relationships between fixed and variable costs under different conditions of uncertainty, and to show and to illustrate very effectively why it is that systems which develop great complexity and fixed cost and efficiency are also necessarily, in the nature of things, more fragile and more subject to the kinds of crises that we're now experiencing in the real world. So our hope is that these ideas, expressed in our book in a range of ways, some of them quite general and some of them quite specific, our hope is that they can make their way into the underpinning of an economics that is actually relevant to the problems of the real world and to the problems that those of you who are working in the UN system must be dealing with on a day-to-day and certainly year-to-year basis. So once again, I'd just say I'm really quite delighted to have had the opportunity to say a few words to outline some of the core principles behind entropy economics, a living basis of value and production, and to commend it to your attention in the hopes that it leads toward as Rick said in his opening remarks, toward a reorientation of the way in which we as economists approach the crucial problems that we've been entrusted to deal with. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, James. Much appreciated. There's a lot in this book to unpack, and you've just given us a very good initial taste, and hopefully that's inspired people's imagination. Next, we're going to turn for comments from two folks I've already introduced, but first over to you, Dr. Anastasia Nesvetailova, who again is the head of the Macroeconomics and Development Policy Branch at the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Over to you, Anastasia.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you very much, Jamie, for offering the opportunity to, first of all, read the book. Many congratulations to you and your co-author. Congratulations to Rick for launching the network and webinar. It's great to have a collective group of thinkers around. It's an honor to discuss, also in kind of my several hats of, once a trade economist, but then a political economist. So questions that were raised in the text about power, the nature of power and the impact of those power in living systems and in economics, very much echo traditional concerns of core political economy, even before it became economics. So first of all, I would like to commend the authors for the ambition of the book. It is not only timely, it's, as Rick said, courageous, precise, because it goes into a quantitatively inspired discussion. And it also confirms maybe my own understanding that the much needed innovation in economic thinking, which had long been wanting and long been coming, probably will not come from economics itself. It will come from interaction with other disciplines, just maybe as economics emerged as itself as a derivative discipline of physics and natural sciences back in late 19th century. Today, I think the most important policy insights, frameworks of analysis, and probably methodologies of working with new data and how to combine this data will come from synthesis of disciplines. So this is one example of and an invitation to others to follow what can be done by bringing together what I would probably call the ecological perspective, and I will invite authors to argue with me or not, or natural science perspective into economic thinking. So it's a very good omen for those of us who are looking for new insights and directions for policy methods, and also questions that can be actually asked. Because one of the areas that, or one of the walls that traditionally separated disciplines and kept economics as this, or mainstream economics as a very theological construction, is the idea that certain questions you don't ask. We deal with price, we deal with allocation, we deal with a variety of either market or economic agents, but we do not really ask questions about power or the nature of concentration or the exercise of power. This was left to other disciplines. So you are now, you have raised this, and you very explicitly said that markets do not work without governmental endorsement or authorization, something that a lot of abstractions in economics simply conveniently assume away. And it's increasingly important, especially today. I will also compliment you on some of the execution of the method, in particular chapter 4, the tour through economic thinking and theories of value. I myself have questions of a fundamentally subjective issue of value for many of us. Where would you take it into discussions of post-industrial capitalism, of capitalism? Some people call it financialized, some people use now the word assetization, or the creation of assets, where value itself is not only split between corporeal and intangible, as Commons would define or once defined, but value becomes an element of division between advanced and developing economies. Value creation mechanisms and institutions become institutions of governance and accounting and power. And of course, value becomes an asset in itself, in a sense that if you, as a high net worth individual, valued in particular thousands of millions or billions of dollars, then the value usually is the value of the companies that you control. The value of these companies then can become a collateral for further exercise of power, borrowing, expansion, investment. Where would you take your productionist understanding of capitalism or the economic system into the post-industrial age? That would be one of my kind of more conceptual questions. In terms of policy insights, I think it's particularly important that you raise the issue of the era of scarcity. In UNCTAD, we have done several investigations of the, I want to call it political economy of food, but it's the concentration of food markets or food trading system as a global concern. It's marked by heavy monopolization, extreme opacity, lack of regulation, enormous power over human concerns, developmental issues, and the future of a large part of humanity. But the part of the lack of political or policy action into the area of food regulation, of food markets, of food speculation, stems from the fact that nobody is really looking at food markets as a systemic or holistic regulator. As we go into the era of scarcity, where food supplies, food production will be heavily affected by demographic shifts, by climate crises, by other emergencies. And so the idea that food is always there and seeds are available and technologies are coming at a rapid pace to feed the world, it looks like we could be in the transition to a very different time period. Where do you take your analysis there? How would you advise us to work with developmental policy, financial trade, holistic policy frameworks to address these issues and advise those who take decisions? So overall, with this, I finish. Thank you very much again. I highly recommend the text. It's a tour de force by the author team.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. And next, we invite comments from Professor Steve Keen. Over to you.
Thank you. Just making sure you can hear me okay. Good?
Yes.
Okay. My comments are quite lengthy, so I'll put them up on, at Jamie's invitation, I'll put them up on my Substack and Patreon pages, so if you can find the full statements there. But if I had to say what I like most about entropy economics, it's that the vast majority of today's economists wouldn't recognise it being a work in economics at all. There's too much about nature in it. There's nothing about how agents form their preferences. There's no proof of the equilibrium conditions. So from the point of view of a mainstream economist, where's the economics? And what that means is entropy economics is one of several works that develops at least part of the new paradigm that economics has needed for over a century. If you go back and take a look at the various founding concepts of neoclassical economics and how they were put in mathematical form, over a century ago, two mathematicians incidentally proved that Walras' general equilibrium was unstable. So goodbye Walras' equilibrium a century ago. Next, the partial equilibrium models of Marshall died when the Oxford Economic Group decided to meet with businessmen to improve both theory and practice, and then found that the businessmen simply couldn't understand what the economists were talking about. And ultimately, the economists found by empirical research that the assumption of diminishing marginal productivity, which underpins the rising supply curve, simply didn't apply to real-world firms. So goodbye the supply curve. Then Paul Samuelson in the 1950s discovered that the only way you could guarantee that the market demand curve sloped down, in other words, obeyed what's called the law of demand, is that there had to be socialist redistributions of income to make everybody's social marginal utility identical. So therefore, a downward sloping market demand curve requires socialism. Well, goodbye the market demand curve. So you have a discipline which is obsessed with its own foundations, but actually has not at all. It's blown its own feet away. Now, economics, conventional economics, therefore should have died like Ptolemy's geocentralism. It just doesn't work. But it hasn't happened. And the analysis we get now is even more extreme than what was put together by Jevons and Marshall and Walras 1.5 centuries ago. And I think if you look at what Jevons and Marshall had to say about equilibrium versus the real world of dynamics, if they could be brought back to life, and that's a fairly neoclassical assumption, let's assume time travel, they would disown their heirs. They'd want something new. So what's happened is conventional economists have turned a stopgap methodology from the 19th century into a creed and to a belief of the actual nature of capitalist economies, which is ridiculous. We're describing the most dynamic and chaotic and evolutionary systems in human history as tending towards equilibrium. And we're giving the typical person the predictive powers of Nostradamus and Jesus Christ. It's just ridiculous. So we need something new, and it won't come from within the profession itself. It has to come from outside. And in that sense, Galbraith has provided a way, with his cooperation with Chen, that the insights from thermodynamics and physics have turned up in the necessary economic guise. And the beauty of their work is that they've managed to do something which neoclassical economics has never done and will never do, and that's give an empirical and quantifiable theory of value based on the concept of scarcity. I've got a few limitations I see in the concept itself, but it's brilliant in the sense that it provides a theory of value which actually has grounded in the physical world and lets you put numbers on empirical factors as they do throughout the book. There's also the idea of thermodynamics turning up. Again, neoclassical economists turn their nose up at that. That's because they don't have a sense of smell. What we find is that you have to see economics and success in economics being judged through time and over time. And one of my favourite phrases in the book is where they talk about economists habitually mistaking immediate utility maximisation for a development strategy. He says, and this, I'll just quote this bit, a successful person, firm or country has arrangements that promote stability over time, even though not every impulse can be or should be satisfied at each moment. This is the most basic common sense, familiar to every parent and every business manager. Only small children and economists sometimes take a different view. Now, the production theory they've worked out as well, let's just bring in concepts which are the unknown unknowns, unappreciated knowns in neoclassical theory. So they bring in the value of output, fixed costs, a discount rate, duration of investment, and even uncertainty into a way to derive a formula in terms of the rate of return. So they've done a brilliant service to building part of the new paradigm that economics desperately needs, but it's not enough in itself, and they acknowledge that. I'd mention two more sources, one of which is my own work, but another that I want to focus on, and that's the work of Ole Peters and Alexandra Adamo in what they call ergodicity economics. Now, ergodicity is something which, as Peters himself has said, economists make a ridiculous assumption that it applies in many, many cases. But in fact, when you look at the conditions under which ergodicity applies, and what that means is that what is the way of maximising your outcomes at a point in time can be used as a development strategy through time, that is vanishingly small number of cases in which that's true, and economics is an area where that is highly unlikely to ever be true, and yet, as Peters says, economists make an indiscriminate assumption of ergodicity. And what I conclude with, and there's some elements of this in the final chapter of Galbraith and Chen as well, is that the greatest damage this is going to do to humanity is the application of the ergodic assumption in the so-called economics of climate change by, frankly, frauds, intellectual frauds, who have received Nobel Prizes for the work on climate change, and then tell us that they think that in the case of all the economists working on climate change, that a 7-degree increase in global temperature over the next 2 centuries will reduce the rate of economic growth by 0.14% per annum, which is barely measurable. So this crazy ergodic assumption, which we have to get rid of, is, I think, going to be the thing which actually destroys what economists think they're studying, and that's capitalism. Now, ironically, that means that this new paradigm to which Galbraith and Chen are essential contributors may only be formed when the subject of its study, the human, sedentary, industrial, capitalist, globalized economy, is in the process of collapse. But that's another reason to accelerate the development of this paradigm, because when these breakdowns start, certainly during the lifetime of people in the audience here, maybe even during mine and Jamie's lifetimes, policymakers will have no idea how we got into this predicament in the first place. And Galbraith and Chen provide one of the explanations as to how we got there and what we have to do to get out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for such an interesting and indeed forceful set of remarks. Just before we go back to you, Professor Galbraith, Anastasia, you have one more comment or question?
Yes, it was inspired partly by Steve's comments about complexity and uncertainty. Jamie, are complex systems always more fragile? Does fragility or the type of fragility depend on the type of complexity? And in any case, what is the role of policy, which has always tended to be very targeted, focused, or narrow by definition of a policy mechanics or policy tool? So a question on complexity.
So we're now going to turn it over to Professor Galbraith, but I just want to flag to participants that you can begin putting your questions in the chat or to raise your hand, and my colleague Juanita will keep track of those who have sought the floor, and we'll try to manage between the two. Over to you, Professor Galbraith.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Anastasia and Steve. I'm really delighted and pleased to have your comments and your reactions to this effort of mine and of Jing Chen's. I'll speak very briefly to I think reinforce some of the comments that Anastasia made, and then come back to Steve. And I see a couple of comments in the chat that I'd also like to address. One of the things that one notices about the standard presentation of economic issues is the priority of marketplace interactions. And if you take a standard introductory course in microeconomics, typically you'll find the consumer presented first, and then somewhere down the road in 5 or 6 weeks, you'll come to the producer and you'll discover the mathematical framework's exactly the same. And production is simply the assembly of factors of production, labor, and capital, according to some technological formula, which is some technological regime which has been given from the outside. And this strikes us as a deeply misguided way of thinking about economic problems, because if you don't produce, there is nothing to consume. And so the question of how you handle production should be first and foremost. And so we put that really at the center of our analysis, alongside the question of value, which I'll come to momentarily. But the issue of production is a question that has to be managed. You start in the present and you think about how you are going to proceed. You're usually trying to do something which hasn't been done before. That is how you would acquire, that is how you gain economic value, how you make profit. You do something that's distinctive, and you do something according to some process that is an improvement over what has been done before. And in order to do that, you have to make plans. And in order to execute plans, you have to make investments, and all that has to happen first. And that's true at the level of the cell, which is trying to photosynthesize sunlight. It's true at the level of the animal organism, which has to have a whole complex structure of things in order to metabolize resources from the environment. It's true of any engine, and it's true of any society. And the plans that we lay out include our habits, our regulations, our laws, our constitutions, which evolves. All societies are different, and that's another reason why you don't have a universal policy principle. So you have a problem of decision making. And the inescapable reality here is that uncertainty is the enemy of profitability when you are making big fixed commitments going into the future. And so controlling the uncertainties so far as possible becomes a very major concern. It's a concern for businesses, it's a concern for large corporations, it's a concern for governments. Those that achieve that over a long period of time can achieve economic development. They can arrive at a state where they are, where the living standards of the population are dramatically better than they were before. Those that do not achieve it can go on for thousands of years without without any particular change in the nature of life, and that certainly has been true in the past. So one has to think about sort of intrinsic, let's say, complication of the development process. This is where we put our emphasis. The mathematics behind this capture all of this in a very straightforward way, and you can just run the formulas through a spreadsheet with numerical examples, and I can give you some. I have some actually on a little slideshow here that I could pull out, but it's all available in the book. So that's where we think you need to rethink the framework for economics, and not just assume that markets which will tend toward balance are going to organize everything for you. It's not true in the real world. The real world proceeds through time and proceeds in the face of uncertainties and changing conditions. And changing conditions with respect to resource quality are crucial to the viability of productive structures. Okay, Steve has done one of the world's great demolition jobs on the existing paradigm, and I couldn't begin to praise it too. I can't praise it too highly. It's it's a landmark work that you've been engaged in for a long time now. I'll just add that, well, to the extent that we do talk about mainstream economics, one of the examples we present is the Arrow-Debreu competitive model, which requires, when you parse it, that there be markets for every product for every moment of time, and that every actor have an endowment of each tradable commodity before the process of exchange even begins. Yeah. Why is this the basis for any thinking about the real world? It just simply can't be. And the efforts to patch that up, that's been known for a long time. Efforts to patch it up are just highly artificial. One just needs to cut through this and start from a different starting point. And the right starting point is to recognize that economics, our mainstream neoclassical economics, was framed at a moment before the second law of thermodynamics was fully understood. And so it never really incorporated it. And Paul Samuelson understood that the entropy law was a massive threat to his framework, which was how he resisted allowing it in. Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen understood 50 years ago that it was, but he didn't develop the idea quite fully. And I think what we contribute is a more complete development of how to think about economic questions in the same way that physicists and biologists think about the issues that face them. Okay, I do want to come to the questions in the chat that Albena Asmanova has put in about inequality and what the perspective there is. I consider that the control of inequality and achieving let's say an element of sustainability in a social process, productive process, requires keeping inequalities under control for as long as possible. And that if you allow them to go out of control, that is in the nature of a crisis. And in fact, measuring inequalities in income, which is something I've been doing for a long, long time as part of a parallel project, you find that the rising inequalities, which may be associated with what we call economic growth, are in fact harbingers of social instability. So this is the connection between the concept of inequality as I would apply it and Asmanova's concept of precarity. They've got aspects of the same phenomenon. I'm not saying here that there would be any advantage to a society in which all resources were distributed on an equal basis. And in fact, human motivation requires that there be degrees of inequality, just as any productive process. It takes advantage of differences in pressure and temperature. And that's part of the way thermodynamics works. It is not against all forms of inequality, but it is to say that a successful society is one that keeps them under control for an extended period of time, and allowing them to get out of control is a source of eventual crisis and failure. Okay, I think that's. I could just take a second here if I just want to pull up the equations and just show you the theory of value here. If you can see it, I think, is just exceedingly simple. A log expression in which the base is the number of suppliers, and the argument, the probability argument, is a measure of scarcity of the product. So something which is quite scarce has a low probability, is going to have a high valuation. And what you can see is that as scarcity, as a product essentially diffuses into the market becomes saturated, its value will fall. Shows up very simply in the equation. Equally, as you increase the number of suppliers and move from a monopolistic, there's no such thing as absolutely perfect monopoly, but a relatively monopolistic position, to one in which there's a large amount of competition, the value, economic value that you can extract from a process falls. And just to go back to this, you can see that when you're talking about multiple processes and you average across them, you've got an expression which is essentially the same as Shannon's expression for the for information. So it's just very closely related to the same concept of information as entropy. And I won't go into, I'll give you an example of just without going through it in detail. You can just plug in numbers for, let's say, a resource-rich region and a resource-poor region with different market sizes and scarcities. and calculate the price of a resource, and you can see how that changes if you combine the two regions into a free trade area. So these things, this expressions have practical implications, and the mathematics is not simply for show. It's not pure algebra intended to impress or intimidate you. You can put numbers in it and work out for yourself whether the results are plausible, and they more or less are. When you come to the theory of production, again, you can just you can put numbers into the equations, and one of the things you'll see, and I won't go through all of this, but I'll just show you this one, is that if you have projects with low fixed costs as compared to projects with higher fixed costs, the equation will tell you that the ones with higher fixed costs have a higher break-even point. You have to have a higher volume in order to make them profitable, and they have a steeper trajectory. And you can push that analysis to get to the point where you understand that when you embark on large-scale projects and put resources into major fixed costs, you're running into greater risk of negative returns when uncertainty increases and the situation moves against you. And this is very closely related to Hyman Minsky's thesis that stability produces instability. The moment you commit yourself to being essentially an advanced, highly efficient society, you are also committing yourself to a greater degree of risk that the returns on economic activity will go negative on you when uncertainty increases, resource costs increase, resource quality deteriorates. And that gets very close to some of the problems that we're obviously facing around the world at the present time.
Thanks very much. We've had another query up in the chat from Stephen Willard Stone, who is asking about your view on the role of institutions in shaping markets and equilibrium, and in particular when prices fail to reflect scarcity or full costs. How are these institutions, governance mechanism structures nurtured and evolved under entropy economics?
What is the role of institutions? Well, institutions are structures of governance and structures of regulation. And so I would argue that they are essential framing necessities for the existence of successful markets. And this is, I think, a matter of practical common sense once you realize practically everything that we do is framed by institutions and regulations. We will not get on airplanes, I trust, if you do not have confidence that the air traffic control is on the job and that the radars are functioning properly. You will not eat raw vegetables, lettuces and salads and so forth, if you do not have confidence that the phytosanitary regulations are keeping the E. coli bacteria out of your your vegetables. If you don't have confidence, then you'll have to go through further measures, high temperature cooking, before you will touch those products. And one can go down the list. I mean, you won't drive nearly so efficiently if you don't have confidence that people respect the traffic lights and the traffic signs. And anybody who's lived around the world can understand that circumstance is really quite different in different places. And the more efficient ones are the ones where the regulations operate in a successful and efficient manner. That is not an argument for every regulation, and it is possible for regulations to go askew, awry, to go wrong, and to be suborned for political purposes. I'm not arguing against that view, but it is an argument that markets, to function effectively, function within regulatory frameworks. And the better the regulatory framework, the better the markets function.
And let me perhaps pick up on that a little bit, because one of the things I so appreciated about your book is your expansion of this notion of regulation. You know, most economists and lawyers, policymakers, they think about regulation in a very instrumental way, but you're talking about it more as a metaphor for regulation in a broader sense, the way a body's physiological systems are regulated. And you're making an argument that you can't, the self-regulatory ethos of extreme versions of liberal economics is at odds, fundamental odds with the way the world works.
I get in my car. My car still has a key, by the way, so I turn the key. That tells you what a dinosaur I am. But I do expect that the radiator and the oil are functioning, and if they're not, I hope that a warning light will tell me. That's a regulatory system. Any productive process is a question of controlling the flow of resources, the metabolism of the process, in a way that is within the limits of the system that's designed to make it function. And that's why reactors have cooling systems, and why we have a whole range of medicines, and in fact internal systems designed to keep our body temperatures within a very narrow range. All of this is part and parcel of the same basic rule for living systems. And part of the reality of life processes, so they don't go on forever. Regulated systems don't last forever. Things break down eventually. Entropy increases even for us, and we'll suffer the consequences in the long run. Deferring that for as long as possible is what we try to do. Live longer, have your machines operate for a longer period of time, and run your societies in a progressive but a stable way.
Yeah, I mean, this notion of homeostasis in the physical and biological sciences there's a regulatory inherent piece there to the way a system functions, which is very different from the way a lot of people have been taught and raised about economics, where you think the market, number one, is the best judge of how resources get allocated, and that regulation comes in a little bit later and has costs or inefficiencies or the like, rather than being a fundamental part of what constitutes a properly functioning system within accepted tolerances, if you will, or design specifications, which for societies is not only increased productive output, but also improved living standards, both in the social and environmental dimensions. And that your concept of regulation, born of this appreciation of physical, biological sciences, I think is a really important distinction in economic thought, number one. And let me just turn to one other thing, which I invite you to
Steve, I just called to Steve. He's been wants to intervene here.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay,
just quickly,
just
to bring another piece of useful mathematics that fits in that concept is what's called persistence theory. And that, again, is an insight from biological mathematics, that what you want in an ecosystem is an outcome that doesn't give you equilibrium, but doesn't drive any of the species to extinction either. And when you apply that to economic thinking, you find that a system that has only the private sector in terms of both private firms, workers and bankers and financial transactions, it fails persistence theory. It's quite likely to collapse into a debt deflation, which we saw in the pre-World War II period. When you include government spending, however weak, as a counteracting, you get a system which has persistence. In other words, the system will not break down. So that's the sort of concept we need. Rather than equilibrium, it's persistence, and that's what our regulations can often help us provide.
I'd like to just jump in here and respond to Marcelo Lafleur, who has a very interesting question in the chat, which I can read. I don't think you did read it earlier. That what mechanism should economics adopt to become more scientific and evidence-based? Do journals and academic structures help or hinder the validation of new paradigms? Is the core issue reproducibility, poor incentives, or something else? And is this shifting with the rise of self-publishing platforms? It's a very important question, and I think it's actually actually been very nicely treated by Angus Deaton in his little book on the looking back on the economics profession. He points out that to become tenured in an economics department, a self-respecting one, in the Anglo-Saxon world, you have to have published in one of 5 journals, 2 of which are house journals for a particular university department, Chicago and Harvard, and the other 3 are controlled by a very small group of very consensus-oriented and conformist mainstream economists. So it's practically impossible to break through that institutional structure, given the way in which the professional hierarchy has been established. And the way out of this can only, I think, be an institutional reform at the level of the universities, in which you get privileged for having a worldview that is much more broadly connected to the allied disciplines, to natural sciences, as well as to anthropology and sociology, and in which you have promotion channels that are rigorous and disciplined, but that run up through alternative structures of publication and professional recognition. And that's one of the things, frankly, that I believe this project can contribute to, because there are really wonderful books that have been produced by a number of rising scholars in recent years. Some of them are here in the audience, actually, and giving those individuals the visibility that I think that they merit. And exposing them to the kinds of comments that I've been very privileged to have over the course of this webinar, is a step in the right direction. It's a step of broadening out the institutional basis and the theoretical basis in the economics profession. And then ultimately, you may be able to get universities and funding mechanisms to devote their resources in a more, let's say, more ecumenical fashion, in a more realistic fashion, in a way which promotes innovation rather than conformity.
We've got another good question from Mark Flurbe in the chat. Is there a relationship between your approach and donut economics?
I'll have to pass on that, because I would have to go and refresh my view with Steve. Steve, you may be able to go ahead on that. Yeah.
I think there is certainly compatibility. I mean, the image, the meme of a donut, which Kate dreamt up, has become a superb way of countering the most successful meme in the history of humanity, and the most dangerous, which is the Marshallian cross. So getting rid of that equilibrium orientation and saying instead there's a inner band where you don't have sufficient fulfillment of human needs, a band of stability, and then a band of overshoot. That is a marvelous contribution. And I think in Kate's work, and also in Isabella Weber's work and so on, there's a range of other contributions to the ones that we've spoken about here. The thing which distinguishes Jamie and Chen's work here is the capacity to turn that into a mathematical modeling system. And that's something which I mentioned in my own work, and also in Peter's and Adamu. We have to get rid of the neoclassical paradigm. To do that, you've got to be able to provide numbers. Politicians are going to demand them. That's probably the only thing neoclassical economists have got going for them. They're really good at making up numbers, but their foundations are rotten. We need a decent foundation, and that's what Jamie's work and also L.A. Peter's work is enabling us to move towards.
Let's pick up on that. James, the great emphasis you put in the book on the mathematical rendering of these concepts. I'm just curious about your main motivation in that. Was it the one that Steve just mentioned, which is basically credibility in the field and perception of rigor by decision makers? Was it that you wanted to kind of win the argument on the field's own current terms, because it's so focused on abstract mathematical reasoning? Or indeed, or did you think that there is, some other abiding merit in taking very, very powerful arguments that you made, and I would even call out some of them as worthy of being axioms. But we can maybe come back to that later. What was your main motivation in applying so much emphasis on the mathematical modeling?
Well, to begin with, I'm privileged to be working with someone who is an actual mathematician, a trained mathematician, and who moved through from mathematics into physics to economics and now teaches finance. And so I'm working with my mind is a literary and historical mind, as you might imagine, but that's Jing Chen's mind has mathematics somehow deeply hardwired into the way he thinks about things, and the point of bringing that into the book is to illustrate the fact that if you have a clear idea, you want to be able to express it in a mathematical form which is simple enough so that people with at least a modest amount of training in this area can grasp what's going on. And so that you can, in fact, plug numbers into it and ask, does this correspond to the common sense of the observations? And I showed the value theory because it's easier to get across in just a very short period. It's just one equation. It's just one equation. It's a logarithm. Anybody who's been through high school has seen that. And all we did was to put the scarcity measure in as the argument of the logarithm. And as I said, it was Jing's thought that the base of the logarithm would capture an element of monopoly power. And it turns out it does very nicely. And so it's a way of saying that this is a very precise idea. This is a very clear idea. It is not something that we're waving our hands and covering up with a lot of English verbiage, although I try to express the English as clearly as I can. But you can look at it and say, you can write it down, you can put it in a spreadsheet, you can put some numbers in it, and you can check. You can put it in your calculator, you can check. And you can say, as the scarcity, as a product disseminates and the scarcity value goes down, how does the value proceed? And of course it declines. And this is why, for example, a firm like NVIDIA has a huge stock market valuation, while a firm like General Motors, which is a vast industrial corporation, much, much larger and produces much, much more, has a very low one. Because General Motors is producing a product which is a century old. And a graphics processing unit is a new product which has a very large market that has not yet been tapped. This is how economic value works. And so we say the mathematics of this captures the real world process. And that's not the case, by the way, for the general equilibrium and the algebra of the journals. Just pick it up and look at it. You can say, what's the point of the mathematics there? It is to establish the credentials of the author, to satisfy their dissertation advisor, to intimidate the reader. But the symbols often have no real world counterparts, or they're some vague psychological construct which has no real world measurement. That's not the mathematics the way we see it. What we're putting here in the book are things which can in fact be quantified. In fact, have to be quantified in the real world if you want to make economic calculations.
In this respect, I love the quote that you surfaced from Nicholas Kaldor, calling the general equilibrium a system of derived tautologies. I just thought that was wonderful. Over to you, Steve.
I spent many Sunday dinners at the Kaldor residence in Cambridge in 1974-75. So I acquired my ideas in an extremely honest way, and from an authority who I revere, to be honest with you, to state it frankly.
And I envy you for it, Jamie. From my point of view, what has happened with neoclassical economics, they've debased mathematics. I'll be blunt. I think they bear as much relation to what they do bears as much relation to mathematics as pederasty does to sex. It's they've abused it. The term that I invented to describe what neoclassicals do is mathematics, and my friend Assad Zaman calls it mathemagics. So what we're doing really is bringing modern mathematics to bear on economic concepts. And on that front, the technology that I use, which is system dynamics, is the sort of thing that Volra and Marshall were pining for 1.5 centuries ago. Their current descendants completely ignore it. We have the technology to do mathematics properly. And to get that right, we've got to get rid of the neoclassicals.
Let me come to this comment and question from Emko Meyenberg, who asks how I think about how institutional setups make markets work, some markets work better than others, and how you distinguish between different regulatory frameworks. So I do want to come back to the comment I've made several times, is that not all regulatory frameworks are as good as others. But I'll give an example that I think clarifies the issue, and that's a longstanding example of the wage regulations in the Scandinavian systems, the Wren-Meidner models that basically came in the early 1950s and prevailed as a framework for wage structures in Sweden over 40 years or so. And what did that achieve? It compressed the wage structure, which meant that if you were a business that was reliant on cheap labor, you had to either reform and improve your productivity or leave the market. And it made it attractive for businesses that relied on high productivity labor to come in and operate in Sweden. And the result of that was to improve the productivity of the Swedish economy and raise the average income in Sweden and make possible the success for a long time of the Swedish welfare state. That strikes me as a way in which you can say regulatory frameworks drive the structure of markets. Is it possible for a regulatory framework to be, let's say, driven in a direction which is counterproductive? The answer is, of course it is. Sure it is. And I would be extremely worried about the way in which, just for example, you say I share Steve Keen's concern about climate change, but at the same time, I really think that one can make a diffuse electrical system function as well as one which has a concentrated source of electrical power and distributes it in an effective way to the whole population. It's extremely complex. You can't just wave your wand and say, let's make this happen with a regulation and have it happen. The regulations have to be in line with what is physically and technically possible at a given time. I'll give you one more example. Due to was told many years ago by my close friend and colleague here, Ray Marshall, who was labor secretary in the Carter administration. In the 1970s, there was a serious problem before in textile mills of something called bisonosis, brown lung disease, cotton dust in the factories, crippling the workers. They put in regulations to control the cotton dust, and this obliged the textile makers to buy equipment, German and Austrian equipment by and large, which then was not only cleaner, but much more efficient. And that preserved the industrial textile industry in the Carolinas, the United States, for decades after they would have otherwise have been driven out. So you can have let's say, a positive relationship between regulatory processes and technological advances, productivity gains, environmental gains. And that's what you should be striving for. But in order to do that, the engineers and the lawyers and the lawmakers have to be singing from the same song sheet. They have to be understanding what they can achieve with the technical possibilities that are there.
I invite colleagues to post additional questions or comments in the chat or to raise your hand. One of the other threads I'd like to pull out here is your distinction between the notion of maximization on the one hand and positive return on the other. which I think goes to the heart of this shift in thinking. Would you mind elaborating on that a bit for colleagues?
Yeah. This idea that the function of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value, to maximize profitability, is, as we say in the book, it's a piece of sophistry that any small child, that any parent has already seen through. You never teach your children to grab everything that they can in a given moment. If you're a hardware store and there's a hurricane coming, you don't raise the price of plywood to the maximum extent because that ruins your customer relations. And businesses, by and large, don't like to increase their prices in the face of small disturbances because that causes them to stick out like sore thumbs and ruins their reputations. They're in this for the long run. They want to earn a positive return that will cause them to be a going concern and they don't want to maximize. And if they may well maximize and have losses. I mean, the maximum may be less than zero. Anybody can see that. So the whole notion that that maximization is it and positive return is not relevant, it's just it's specious in the extreme. So again, we think about this with things economists are taught to sort of say and not think about. This is probably, I can't think of a better example of miseducation actually than that particular way of framing things. Steve?
I also think it helps to invoke biology and physical sciences here as well. There's such a thing as, that we all recognize as very malign growth, uncontrolled cell growth, for example. So that there can be a counterproductive production process that yields increased output, and there can be one that is, solves for a number of different objectives of society. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, this is a point which is raised by the book by Ole Peters, which is only coming out next month, by the way, and that's ergodicity, because an assumption of ergodicity is that probability across space can be used as a substitute for what happens over time. Now, that's built into the concept of expected utility, which is the foundation of conventional finance theory. And Ole gives a beautiful example of a coin toss, where if you toss a coin and get heads, you get 1.5 times your wager. If you get tails, you get 0.6. The expected value of that wager is $1.05. So you put down $1, you get $1.05, you gain 5 each time. You should go ahead and do it. But if you actually do it in the real world, you don't get the space average. You get what happens if you rebet the time, the winnings and losses, time and time and time again. So if you do that on 100 tables at once, you'll get $105. If you put down $100 and do it over 50 coin cost pairs, of which give you both heads and tails, so you get 50 heads and 50 tails, you turn your $100 into 72 cents. So that is a classic illustration of what it was maximizes your utility at a point in time is not a strategy for development through time. It's actually a strategy for failure.
I'll come to a maybe somewhat parallel story from the long-term capital management saga of 1998 or so, and which they were making bets on very narrow margins that they considered to be sure things. And a colleague of mine said, it's like betting on Secretariat to show in the Belmont. And I said, yeah, that's a good example, except that if the race is run every day and you double your bet, you replace the bet every time, you're certainly going to lose everything at a given moment. I think that's close enough to the story you're telling, Steve, to place it in some real world context, if people remember who Secretariat was.
Yeah, Albena, as Manova comments, positive return makes it clear why degrowth is such an unfortunate label. I'd like to, unless you want to speak to that, James, I'd like to raise one other question.
Sorry, say it again.
Unless you'd like to speak to Albena's comment in the chat on positive return makes it clear why degrowth is such an unfortunate.
I agree with the comment. It is an unfortunate choice of terms. You run at a negative return for a sufficient period of time, your economic system is not going to function according to the principles. You would like to have a system that that motivates people to produce and cooperate with the expectation of realistic and modest positive returns. If you, again, allow the structure of returns to become completely lopsided, and this is where your inequality and your fragility and your crises emerge. If you allow them all to go negative, well, then you need to think about how you reduce the burden of fixed costs in order to bring the returns back to a positive level. And sometimes you can do that. I keep harping on the fact that my country, the United States, runs an enormous military budget for no function that is related to the national security of the country, the safety of the world, and is rooted in technologies whose obsolescence is now incredibly clear, and getting rid of it, reducing it by a dramatic amount, would not be a cost to national security, but would in fact be a benefit for the functionality of the economy as a whole, release resources to more sustainable purposes. Similarly, the financial system has grown to a point where it's far beyond in scale and in use of resources any contribution it may be making or may have made to the general welfare. Instead, what we see is pressure on the Social Security system, which is a very actually low fixed cost system that provides a lot of benefit. So thinking about where you have to, when you run into a resource constraint, where you can trim effectively is a crucial policy problem.
Maybe, we do have a number of UN colleagues around the world on the line here who work, and in the room, who work on practical social development, environmental issues in a range of countries. Just maybe like to, as we near the end of the session, invite you to maybe reflect a bit on which one or two additional specific such problems do you think entropy economics thinking would help to advance? And just as you're thinking about that, Anastasia mentioned agricultural and food issues, and I have been struck over the years at how much a disconnect there is between orthodox thinking about markets and free trade and agricultural production and food security on the one hand, and a more homeostatic approach or entropy economics type of approach where you understand that you shouldn't be waiting for a crisis to basically put in buffer stocks and other types of regulatory approaches to ensuring that you strike a good balance between production on the one hand and security on the other. The Indian government has been beating the drums about this for a long time and running into a lot of difficulty, in part because of the installed conventional wisdom about agriculture should be treated like any other part of the economy. But over to you. Is there one or two other examples of current development issues that you think would greatly benefit from some entropy economics style thinking?
Things that we have not yet covered. Give me a hint and set me on my path, Rick. What do you have in mind?
I mean, what's interesting, I've given you one on the maybe positive side, which is the food issue. One of the things that I found most fascinating about your book, and you alluded to it a bit earlier in your comments today, is how this thinking intersects with the climate change agenda. You have put some cautionary notes out about almost kind of a reality check of the current process in the UN system and elsewhere on climate action vis-a-vis the reality of physical laws and whatnot. Anyway, those are two hints, food and climate, but I imagine there are others.
Yeah, okay, I'm fully on board with that. I think with climate, one has to recognize that there are important priorities in the development process, and that countries which have great energy deficits, electricity deficits, developmental deficits, should not be bearing the burden of climate mitigation. That should be borne by by the national security establishments of countries which have bloated militaries to begin with, and one can go down the list. I mean, one should be picking the targets for better use of the resources that should be economized than we are now doing. I think is very clear. The other area that would just come to mind is in the global financial relationships. It's obvious that one cannot have a successful development process which is constantly running into the unpayability of extraordinarily heavy debts. And that, I think that's something I've been engaged with all my life. I was involved with the legislation to prevent the bankruptcy of New York City in 1975, and I was involved with the crisis in Mexico and elsewhere, and in Brazil in the 1980s, and on through this Asian crisis and beyond. And this is a system which it's not been designed effectively to support economic development. It was been essentially designed to facilitate the global work of the financial sector. And that, again, is a massive distortion. It really is an anti-development situation. Steve?
Quick thought?
Yeah. On the same front, if you had the approach that Galbraith and Chen put forward, we would never have used cost-benefit analysis to say whether we should or should not address climate change. And on the front of the ergodic assumptions that are made by neoclassical economists without even being aware that that's what they're doing, I think that set us up for catastrophe. So if we had the wisdom of Galbraith and Chen and Peters and Adamo, we would not be in the predicament we are now, where we're going to get degrowth whether we like it or not. It's a bad term, but it's a real reality. And that, I think we can shaft home specifically to the stupidity of the foundations of neoclassical economics.
We're coming to the end of our time. I'm going to invite you, Anastasia, to make a final quick point if you wish, and then turn it back to you for the last word, James.
Thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you, Rick, for giving me this 30 seconds. I think I would still want to have a continuation of this book and the questions that it opened. One of the worrying kind of policy debates that emerges in private partly sector, but also some policy discussions in developmental framework is the emergent corporate sovereignty governing our economic, social, cultural being. And I think the intersection of entropy economics or ecological approaches or a living being to understand economic complexity should be really the next effort of bright minds who are writing it. I think with the combination of technological changes, the fragmentation of the state, the fragmentation of some geopolitical certainties, I think it's a real danger to both climate concerns, to economic distribution, inequality, but also financial and economic stability. So I think corporate sovereignty could be the next subject to be addressed collectively or individually.
Okay, thanks. Over to you, James, for a final thought, and then I'll wrap the session up.
Well, I will only, first of all, just reiterate my thanks to you, Rick, for the initiative you've taken in organizing this beginning of what I hope will be, and I'm sure will be, a much larger project. Because what needs to happen here is to provide a forum where the voices of the next generation of, let's say, free-thinking, realistic economists and related specialists can begin to be heard in the global community. The UN network is obviously an ideal place to do this because the audience that we're trying to reach is concerned with these problems on a day-to-day and real-world basis. And so it's been a real privilege and a pleasure for me, once again, to have the opportunity to present my work with Jing Chen on this, on the foundations of economic thinking. And I'm looking very much forward to working with you to push this project forward and to bring, let's say, truly new voices to the fore, because it is a crucial task for all of us at the present time. So once again, thanks very much, and thank you, Steve, and thank you, Anastasia, for your remarks.
Thanks, Anastasia and Steve, and thanks and congratulations to you, James, in providing this intellectual leadership. This has indeed been the first activity of this working group that we have in the United Nations Economist Network on human-centered economics and sustainable development. And we expect and invite suggestions about further such topics, particularly books, but not necessarily limited to books, that really go at the fundamental underpinnings of our conception and practice of growth and development. So thanks to everyone who has participated today, to the three of you, and with that, this session is closed.